Hi there, welcome to this video. It's going to be discussing the OCR Economics Advanced Information for your exams in the summer of 2022. So again, this is focusing on economics, all right, and we're gonna run through the specifics rather than the general aspects of it. All right, so again, format structure remains unchanged. This notice covers all examined components. All right, essentially, you're not allowed to take this in the exam, and it's advised that the teaching and learning should still cover the entire subject content specification. The government believes it is important that students cover the curriculum as fully as possible so that they are as well prepared as possible for progression to the next stage of their education. Yeah, absolutely, but I mean, that's a bit of a political answer. Why would the examining body not tell us that actually, you know what? When we're learning about micro, macro, everything's interconnected. Okay, it's interconnected. It is intertwined, interdependent, and so forth. You can't learn any of these things in isolation. You can't. It's impossible. Okay, and I'll give you an example as I go along. So these are the topic areas for Microeconomics Paper 1. Allocation of scarce resources. Allocation of resources. Nice and easy. So that's coming from what is economics essentially, and so usually small questions are stemmed from that part of the syllabus. Elasticity. Now we need to learn about all realms of elasticity, whether it's PED, price, cross, or income elasticity of demand and supply. Okay, and so does this mean that they're going to ask an isolated question on this? Potentially. They can ask isolated information or questions on that topic area, but elasticity comes into market failure, it comes in to government intervention, it comes in to business objectives, it comes in to monopolies, oligopolies, and it actually comes in to in terms of supply, it comes into, and demand actually, the interaction of labor markets. So what does this mean? Does it mean you learn about this in isolation and only theoretical? Absolutely not. It's crucial, and I'm telling you this now, not just because the government thinks so, not that OCR doesn't think so, but it's crucial that you learn about these topics, and this is kind of advice number one, you learn about these topic areas holistically. Okay, it's crucial that you do that. You apply elasticity to everything. All right? Market failure and externalities. So what does that mean? Does it just mean externalities, or does it mean market failure as a whole? Use market failure as a whole. Okay, it's crucial that you do that. So we have market failure and externalities. So 2.8, this is in reference to externalities and externalities only. So if we go here, market failure, we need to understand the marginal, social, private costs and benefits, and relating them back to positive and negative externalities. And we need to make reference to them in terms of explaining with the aid of a diagram. Okay, so it looks as though they're going to be discussing these from not just a production perspective, but consumption perspective as well. And I know it just says explained, but I would also learn in terms of how to evaluate them as well. All right, that will be key, because that's where the government intervention comes in. So if you're talking about government intervention in terms of 2.11, look, taxes, subsidies, government expenditure, price controls, buffer stock systems, public-private partnerships, legislation, regulation, tradable pollution permits, information provision, and competition policy. You need to be able to explain all of them. All right, and potentially, and most likely, how they would solve the positive and negative externalities that we will be discussing. And that's from a kind of a year 12 perspective than what you'd learn in year 12. And also that's where the evaluation's actually going to come in. So what is the effectiveness and the kind of the consequences of the government intervening using these topic areas or these methods? All right, so that's where probably one of the big questions is going to come from, or one of the big questions or questions with regards to the case studies are going to come from. Business objectives, profit max, sales revenue max, growth max, cost minimization, profit satisficing, etc. will need to be understood as well. So if we go to 3.1, again, look at all of these: sales volume, utility as well, social welfare, corporate social responsibility, having a wider understanding of the business objectives. And potentially you'll link it to, it might be in relation to maybe these two topic areas from a monopoly, oligopoly, depends. Even if they don't ask it, you can bring it in as well. Costs and economies of scale. So understanding the different types of economies of scale in the long run and also in the short run in terms of diminishing marginal returns. And so that's key as well. Understanding that the minimum efficient scale is part of the productive efficiency crew, and potentially how that all links in with monopolies and oligopolies. Okay, so there could be a question about monopolies. Again, could be a big question, and it's important that you actually cover monopolies and oligopolies in serious depth. All right, understand the diagrams. Be able to draw the diagrams with your eyes closed. What are the characteristics? Discussing the way that oligopolies and monopolies operate. There could be just a question on how an oligopolistic market structure, but there's also a legal monopoly within. So talking about market share. All right, so that could be an understanding. So if we go to those sections there, so understanding, dynamic and X efficiency, understanding all of these in terms of price discrimination from a productive and allocative efficient profit maximizing monopolist standpoint as well. And then advantages, disadvantages of both a monopoly and a natural monopoly. And essentially similar things apply to oligopolies, where we need to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of them, making sure you can calculate and evaluate concentration ratios, the kink demand curve, collusive agreements, and product differentiation as well. Okay, understanding that they don't compete on price in theory. All right, and then we've got the interaction of labor markets. When we go through labor markets, it's talking about the interaction here. Okay, does it mean that you don't need to understand the demand and supply of labor? Absolutely it does, because how are you going to discuss any of these things? You need to draw diagrams for these areas. How are you going to draw the diagrams if you haven't learned about demand and supply of labor? Okay, so it's important that you do that. And this is where a big question might come up in terms of where they might ask about the impact evaluate the impact of a monopolist employer on the labor market, or evaluate the impact of trade unions on increasing wages in the labor market. Okay, so that's from a paper one standpoint. And again, the usual, what you would need to do anyway, calculating elasticities, percentage changes, understanding graphs and so forth. From a paper two standpoint, paper two, I would go through it in terms of from a macro perspective. You just learn everything because it's so crucial from a writing perspective to get that AA star, that any of these questions can be examined. Even if there's a question about fiscal policy, do you know what you need to potentially bring in? AD. You need to bring in AS. You need to bring in the multiplier effect. You need to bring in economic growth, potentially development, employment, inflation. The impacts on all of these factors are so key that when you're answering a question about economic growth, or if you're asking about a macroeconomic policy such as reducing corporation tax on businesses, for example, you need to bring in so many factors that you learning certain topics. Skipping, for example, let's have a look. So skipping 2.5 in terms of balance of payments doesn't make any sense. What that means here is in paper 2, it's just not going to be asked in isolation. It's not going to be asked. But it doesn't mean you don't learn it. Okay, so a lot of the big questions usually come up about macroeconomic policies and maybe resolving or achieving some of these macroeconomic objectives. And then you've got to evaluate those policies as well. And then in terms of paper 2, again, you can talk about There might be bigger questions on financial sectors. Usually they come up maybe trade policies as well. So if we go to 4.4, protectionism, free trade areas, customs unions, monetary unions. So you need to understand a lot of that. So usually they ask questions about the restrictions of that free trade. So you're talking about tariffs, quotas, and so forth, because you have to understand the advantages and disadvantages. So if there's going to be a big question here, then they'll ask it about that. From a money and interest rate standpoint, obviously you learn about the monetary policy. So this is about money supply and so forth, and you got to explain the determination of interest rates. So a lot of the smaller questions will come from here because it's only an explain. But from a financial sector perspective, you have to evaluate the role of the financial sector on economic development. Okay, so that's where another bigger question can come in, or even quite smaller ones. So that looks like that's where it's going to be, essentially, and then you'll need to understand all of these as well. So learning that section in isolation won't make any sense, because you have to understand money, interest rates. You got to understand, if you're going to evaluate it, maybe the development is to do with the restrictions in development, or the barriers to development for that country are to do with the fact that they have an extremely weak exchange rate, for example. So their terms of trade or their economic growth capabilities are limited. There's that bottleneck whereby maybe they've got a corrupt government, maybe they've got too high inflation. So learning this in isolation without everything else is just incorrect. Okay, so don't let this mislead you. Again, I'm going to mention it. I'm mentioning it loads of times. Moving on to paper 3. Again, of course, you've got the multiple choice. So a lot of these will be, there's quite a lot of information here. So again, this is pretty much the majority of the papers, or the syllabus, sorry. And essentially, there's nothing to look out for here, nothing to watch out for. There's nothing there that sticks out. All I would say for paper 3 is learn everything, understand everything. What you've done for paper 1 and 2 is going to be very similar to what you need for paper 3. What a lot of students don't do for paper 3 is they don't focus on answers. They don't prepare for it until they've completed the first 2 papers. Or maybe they'll do 1 practice paper for paper 1 and 2. That's not enough, all right? What's key here is making sure that, look, it's a holistic paper, so it's got micro and macro, and as you can see, look, it's got a significant portion of everything in terms of what's going to be involved. So if we, for example, this one doesn't have financial regulation, so fair enough, we don't need to understand the purpose and methods of financial regulation. We don't need to evaluate the regulation of financial. You could probably potentially skip it in terms of not focus too much on practice papers or answering that specific question. Okay. But as you can see, for kind of 4.1, so in terms of the international side of things, the global context, exchange rates, globalization, trade policies, they're key here. And not that they weren't key here, but only trade policies came up. So here they're going to ask specific questions about globalization, exchange rates, trade policies. Okay, and obviously the common. Can you see the common denominators here? Again, like obviously a lot of that macro that you would have learnt in the first section of your year 12 and the bit early sections of your year 13. They're always going to come up. Okay, so don't get it twisted in terms of you don't need to know it, what you do. Okay, so my advice to you is take this with a pinch of salt in terms of see where the bigger questions might come from. Again, ask us if you need to, if you're worried about where to focus your attention. Don't focus your attention too much on the nitty gritty. For example, look, there's no monopolistic competition, right? Monopolistic competition. Here, there isn't any here. So you can probably safely say that monopolistic competition is probably not going to come up. So I don't need to focus too much on it. But do I need to maybe compare an oligopoly or a perfect competition to a monopolistic competition? Yeah, probably. that might need to come up. So you might need to make a mention of it. And this is my point about don't focus on what's here too much in terms of missing out other areas. So the opportunity cost of you not learning about aggregate supply for paper 2 is just stupid. I'll be honest, because I mean, like it says it here, you need supply here, but imagine it didn't mention it here in isolation, so you might go, yeah, I don't need to know it. Okay, so you need to understand it. You need to know. Okay, just because it doesn't mention balancing the budget, for example, here. So if you're talking about or balance of payments, for example, there's no mention here. It doesn't mean that you don't need it, because there could be a scenario where fiscal policy is brought in and you need to understand the impact it might have on the exchange rate or the currency or the balance of payments and so forth, and how that then influences aggregate demand. Okay, so take that with, like, again, I'll say it, take this with a pinch of salt in terms of fully focusing. What you should do is maybe just pick and choose certain questions where you see fit that actually have come up here, right? And then answer those questions, because that's the best way to probably tackle this. All right. And again, yeah, if you have any questions, just ask us. All right. I'll see you in the next video.